Pre-war Grand Prix racing is full of legends like Tazio Nuvolari, Bernd Rosemeyer, and Luigi Fagioli. But one of their contemporaries lived a life so similar to a Greek tragedy that you'd be forgiven for thinking his life story came directly from a book of myths. That man is Achille Varzi. Varzi is perhaps best known as the rival to the formidable Tazio Nuvolari. He was a man who died tragically in a race just after the close of World War II, and yet despite his success, fans and pundits have wondered for years just how much more successful Varzi could have been had a morphine addiction not derailed his life just as he was about to cement his status as an Italian star. Today on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, we're delving into the complex story of the exceptional Achille Varzi. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. To start off our episode today, I want to take a moment to discuss drugs, addiction, and the roles they've played in society, including a few reasons this episode was such a challenge to research. The first evidence of opium poppy cultivation dates back to around 3400 BC in Lower Mesopotamia, by which point the intoxicating effects of the plant were well known. Sumerians called the poppy the joy plant, and cultivation existed for centuries before the Sumerians passed the art down to the Assyrians, who passed it down to the Babylonians, who passed it down to the Egyptians. Around 1300 BC, opium poppies were being cultivated in Thebes in the throes of a bustling trade route. The Phoenicians and Minoans started transporting this product into Greece, Carthage, and Europe. And around 200 years later, on Cyprus, locals were developing specialized surgical tools to effectively cultivate the plant. Hippocrates himself, the father of modern medicine, pointed out just how helpful opium could be for certain ailments. And all the while, the plant was spreading into Asia along growing trade routes. But by 1300 AD, there's an evolution in how opium and morphine were perceived. During the Holy Inquisition in Europe, anything associated with the East was considered evil, and opium was one such product. It's likely that opium cultivation, trade, and consumption still continued all around Europe, but growing sects of Christian religion began to treat indulgences and products like opium with serious disregard. But time still keeps flowing, and a few hundred years later, opium's profile changes again. In the 1500s and 1600s, growing advances in science saw opium gain more traction in the medical world in Europe. By 1803, European physicians believed they had perfected and tamed opium, basically that they had made it safe for more regular medical consumption, even as opium use both medically and recreationally was on the rise. Advances in medical technology meant morphine wasn't injectable by syringe until 1853, but soon after, researchers began synthesizing more drugs from the poppy plant. By the end of the 19th century, opium consumption was becoming such a problem that legislatures around the world were forced to implement laws restricting the sale and distribution of opium. Opium's primary product that we knew of at that time was morphine. Morphine became so addictive, however, that researchers began trying to synthesize other drugs that they would consider safer and easier to use. In the early 1900s, that meant we got the official introduction of heroin, which was supposed to be a step-down drug designed to ease morphine addiction, but it caused issues all of its own, resulting in a ban on heroin in the United States and the emergence of a sweeping black market. All of this brings us to the 1920s and 1930s, where in Europe, drugs like morphine were accessible, but where addiction and recreational use could be stigmatized, and where addiction was becoming a serious problem. None of this, however, accounts for the cultural place that morphine and opium held in Europe, especially in the quote-unquote polite society or wealthier classes. Somehow, in several European countries, morphine use had become feminizing. Male morphine users were depicted as being passive victims of the drug, someone who had sampled the drug once, perhaps, but became wrapped up and trapped in its spell. That's deeply antithetical to a lot of the tenets that made up masculinity at the time. There was this belief in the strong, sound, self-sufficient male. Men were supposed to be providers, yes, but disconnected ones. Men who would keep their family at arm's length because they were expected to be out facing danger with swagger and aggression, and to turn up their noses at the creature comforts and vulnerabilities that would make life easier. That's a big part of why the narcotic use had become feminizing. You could drink beer or wine without question because those were the kind of natural products that a man could make with his own hands. But morphine was a seemingly synthetic escape from the modern world, one that calmed aggression and made the user vulnerable. Those were perfectly fine attributes for poets and artists to indulge in, but if you were an otherwise hard-working man with a morphine addiction, you were being victimized by a feminizing substance, and that was the equivalent to a social death. Of course, this is all because women were not looked upon highly. Where men were supposed to have the inner strength to say no to temptation, women were assumed to be inherently weak and give in to any temptations facing them because they were basically seen as having no autonomy. Women were civilized, but only because the men around them were keeping them civilized. And as women gained more rights to freedom, they would also inevitably gravitate toward illicit substances like morphine, thanks to their so-called inherent lack of self-control. In a high society French newspaper from 1890, one particular type of morphine user is described as, quote, 30 years old, blonde, very slim, very graceful, pretty but a little faded, bored. In this instance, morphine was portrayed as a pastime that upper-class women would turn to when they had no social engagements or operas to attend. The other kind of morphine user was also female, though she was described as, quote, older than 30, and that she one day fell out with someone with a stronger will than her own or came up against cruel indifference. The shock was so brutal, she was as if broken by it. This type of morphine user, then, indulged in the drug as a way to escape from the terrible realities of life. Now, this is all obviously pseudoscientific in nature, but they were powerful social mindsets that would take years to shake. While women were expected to be addictive by nature, there was a serious social stigma associated with upper-class women partaking in morphine use, even though they likely had the easiest access to the drug. Meanwhile, men who used the drug were viewed as falling victim to a corrupt version of feminine manipulation. The only men who could escape that view and emerge with a slightly less tarnished reputation were doctors, who were seen as having both an uncommon proximity to the drug as well as having seen the worst of human suffering. A doctor's addiction could be somewhat forgiven. Critical for our purposes in this episode is a consideration of drug use and abuse in Nazi Germany. In the Weimar era after the First World War, most addicts were veterans who used those drugs to cope with trauma or the physical injuries sustained in battle. As the Nazis took over, that mindset initially held true. See, Nazi physicians believed that some addicts could be cured because they were inherently good men, perhaps ones who had admirably served their country. But there was also a growing belief that other folks had grown addicted because they were just inherently weak of spirit. Drug use was criminalized and actively policed among specific social, religious, or ethnic groups that the Nazis believed to be inherently impure. But if you were part of the military or of the upper class, the rules were different. Methamphetamines played a huge role in Nazi German military, and if you were an upper-class person with enough connections, there's a good chance plenty of folks would look away while you engaged in a taste of morphine every now and again. Italy, too, displayed a level of biological determinism associated with drug use and addiction, namely that the people who were most likely to become addicted to drugs probably came from a long line of criminals or other people who displayed deviant social behaviors. If you were of good social standing, then you were assumed to be of good moral standing, and that would mean you were more likely to be able to control your use of drugs or alcohol before it became a problem. Are you tired of the same old boring motorsport merchandise? Me too. That's why this season, Deadly Passions Terrible Joys is partnering with Home Field Apparel, a sporting apparel company that has released some exceptional collections inspired by the racing world. If you're looking for great shirts and hats designed right in Speedway, Indiana, then head down to the description to learn more about Home Field. And don't forget to use the code DPTJ15 at checkout for 15% off your first purchase. Born in Gagliati, Piedmont, Italy, much of what we know about Achille Varzi has been defined by contrast, namely by comparing him to his arch-rival Tazio Nuvolari. Both men were considered iconic Italian racing drivers, both of whom got their start in motorcycle racing before swapping to the four-wheeled discipline. Despite their 12-year age gap, the two were part of the same racing circles for much of their lives, and yet we know so much more about Nuvolari than we do about Varzi. We know that Varzi was a chilly, aloof, well-born son of a textile magnate from near Italy, that he was the antithesis of the volatile Nuvolari on and off the track, where Varzi maintained an impeccably ordered persona. We know that Varzi drove only in personally pressed linen coveralls and was seldom seen without a cigarette laconically drooping from his unsmiling lips, while Nuvolari raced in a wild wardrobe of knickers, argyle knee socks, and a yellow short-sleeved shirt with a tortoiseshell brooch at his throat. Where Varzi never seemed to put a wheel wrong while he was driving, Nuvolari lashed his cars around the course in a series of wide-open throttle power slides to the point where he allegedly credited with inventing the four-wheel drift. The two drivers were so distinct that Italian fans rallied behind their favorite, the cold, composed Varzi, or the ebullient Nuvolari. In so many books, this is the extent of Achille Varzi's portrayal. We know so much about the colorful Nuvolari, but so much less about his rival, which means we often have to make do, piecing together Varzi's life story from the crumbs of contrast littered throughout articles and books on Nuvolari. So, let's piece together what we know. Achille Varzi was born to a wealthy family in the textiles business, though the details of his childhood are ones seemingly unavailable to the English-speaking internet. Varzi had an older brother, Angelo, who seemingly introduced a young Achille to the thrill of motorcycle racing. In his late teens and early 20s, Varzi raced countless bikes from brands like Sunbeam and Moto Guzzi and made a whopping 7 outings at the notably dangerous Isle of Man TT. His first victory came at the Tuguglio circuit in 1922. The following year, at age 19, he won the 350cc Italian Championship. In 1924, he took wins in both the 350 and 500cc classes, and he also brought home the Nisbet Shield Award for sportsmanship. See, another rider had fallen in front of him at the Tourist Trophy, and Varzi was forced to choose between crashing into a wall or running over the rider. Varzi chose the wall. Thankfully, he was able to walk away without any significant injuries. It wasn't until 1928, when he was 24 years old, that Varzi made his swap to four wheels after trying out a Type 35 Bugatti in 1926. In 1929, he had already managed to become a champion of Italy driving the Alfa Romeo P2, an honor that saw Enzo Ferrari, then the team manager for Alfa Romeo's motorsport endeavors, to offer Varzi a seat on the official team. Varzi's rivalry with Tazio Nuvolari began almost instantly. The two racers were competing in the same motorcycle circles at the same time before joining the Bianchi motorcycle team together in 1928. In 1930, when Nuvolari started his own team to go racing on four wheels, Achille Varzi decided the best way to beat his newfound rival was to join him. Achille Varzi hired his own mechanic, Guido Bignami, to work on his Type 35 Bugatti, but Varzi found that he still couldn't unearth a competitive advantage against Nuvolari, even with a personal mechanic. So Varzi bought that aforementioned Alfa Romeo P2, as well as a Maserati, just in case. The tides truly began to turn for Varzi in 1930, when he joined Enzo Ferrari's Alfa Romeo team. That year, he took victories at iconic races like the Coppa Acerbo and the Targa Florio, as well as victories at the Monza and Spanish Grand Prix. At the Targa Florio, Varzi made a massive impression. When his Alfa Romeo burst into flames, he simply instructed his co-driver to bat it out with a seat cushion while he continued racing at full bore. Heading into 1931, however, Varzi found it wise to swap teams. Much like his later mentee Juan Manuel Fangio, Varzi had a keen sense of what made a certain team successful and when it might be best to defect from one team to the next. That intuition told him it was time to head off to Bugatti, where he'd remain for several years. However, the Bugatti period was challenging for Varzi. While he was able to notch up several critical wins, including the Monaco Grand Prix after a truly incredible battle with Nuvolari, the French Grand Prix, two Tuning Grand Prix, and even the Tripoli Grand Prix, his machinery was dogged by reliability issues that saw him regularly retiring from races. Making matters even worse, his win at the Tripoli Grand Prix in 1933 was subject to intense scrutiny. As we talked about in a previous episode of DPTJ titled The African Race Fixing Scandal That Never Happened, the 1933 Tripoli race was bogged down by allegations that a group of drivers had chosen the winner of the event. This was due to a lottery system, where fans were able to buy lottery tickets and a lucky handful would be assigned a driver. If their driver won the race, that person would walk away with millions of dollars. Allegedly, Varzi and several other drivers conspired with Varzi's ticket holder to split the winnings amongst them all should Varzi win. But as we found out in that episode, the whole fiasco is easily debunked. It's just a myth that has persisted ever since, thanks to its inclusion in Alfred Neubauer's biography. By 1934, Varzi's opinion of the Bugatti team had soured, and he returned once again to Alfa Romeo by the request of the great Enzo Ferrari. But in 1935, Ferrari had other ideas. See, Tazio Nuvolari had come back to the driver market, and Ferrari considered Varzi's rival to be almost godlike in his racing abilities. Because Varzi had a clause in his contract that forbade any team from signing Nuvolari to race alongside him, Varzi decided it was time for a change. That change came in the form of Auto Union, a German racing manufacturer. By 1935, it was clear that Germany was going to be an almost unstoppable force during the coming years of Grand Prix racing. As part of a ploy to foster both technological development and nationalistic fervor, the Nazi regime had begun funneling money into motorsport. State-backed powerhouses like Auto Union and Mercedes were able to build cars the likes of which no other automaker had ever seen before. And for Varzi, it seemed like a great fit. But almost immediately, things began to fall apart. Also part of the Auto Union team that year was a young driver named Paul Peach, but it was his wife Ilse who caught Varzi's eye. Ilse and Varzi struck up a covert affair that quickly became public, and soon the two were inseparable. Ilse Peach filed for divorce from her husband, her second divorce in her young life, and she and Varzi began to travel the world. In 1936, though, something happened, but we aren't exactly sure what. At some point that year, Achille Varzi tried morphine. It's said that Ilse Peach first offered it to him in Tripoli after the governor of Libya toasted Hans Stuck as the winner of the Grand Prix, despite Varzi crossing the finish line first. Varzi was so incensed by the slight from the governor that he couldn't sleep. Ilse allegedly offered him morphine to help his spinning mind calm down. That conclusion is much debated today. Some researchers believe that Ilse Peach wasn't actually present in Tripoli in 1936, so she couldn't have offered Varzi morphine at that race. That the Tripoli story is effectively a fabrication, and it is, again, traced back to Alfred Neubauer's autobiography. Neubauer includes this story in full, including conversations between Ilse Peach and Achille Varzi. He probably wouldn't have heard those conversations to begin with, but certainly not if Ilse Peach was never in Tripoli. In fact, some historians also struggle to believe that Ilse Peach was wholly responsible for Varzi's addiction. It's not clear if she was the person to initially offer him the morphine, or if Varzi had come across it himself. But the assertion that Peach was a morphine user who tempted Varzi down a dangerous, desperate path does fit right in with the cultural belief at the time that women were the primary users of morphine and that men had to be somehow tempted into using, probably by a woman. Some historians argue that Varzi likely tried the drug for the first time in 1936, but of his own accord. After all, morphine was a commonly prescribed painkiller at the time, and it is completely possible that a doctor had instructed him to use it to curtail something like a stomach ailment or to ease the pain of a previous racing injury. Even if Ilse Peach had it, perhaps she wasn't even addicted. Perhaps she had just acquired it by the same means, to cure some ailment. We do know, however, that very few people are willing to talk about Varzi and Peach's affair. But this combination of an affair mixed with morphine use seemingly resulted in a full-on icing out of Varzi from Italian social life. Later in 1936, Varzi sustained a massive crash at over 120 to 180 miles per hour, and author Chris Nixon claims that Varzi was so shook by the incident that he turned to morphine to calm his nerves. At that point, the die was allegedly cast. Varzi had fallen down the morphine rabbit hole. He became more difficult to work with, refusing to drive in Barcelona before being outclassed by teammate Bernd Rosemeyer at the Eifel Rennen Grand Prix. He failed to turn up at the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, and then failed to show up for the Coppa Acerbo. Auto Union sent its team doctor off to find him, and Varzi was allegedly discovered in a villa near Rome, scruffy, rambling on aimlessly, and high. Auto Union chose not to renew Achille Varzi's contract for the following year. In 1937, the year after Varzi's first alleged use of morphine, he took home a sixth-place finish at the Italian Grand Prix, the only championship Grand Prix that he contested that year. He won the non-championship San Remo Grand Prix with Maserati, but his composure was slipping. A once stable Varzi slurred his speech, chattered senselessly, and lived on nothing but champagne, cigarettes, and morphine. His formerly clean driving style was shattered in light of his addiction. Perhaps his inability to control the car frightened him. The already elusive Varzi became ever harder to reach. If his presence at races in 1936 were erratic, they were worse in 1937. If he turned up at the track, he did so with strange, inexplicable wounds. In 1938, he showed up to one race, and that was it. No one quite knows exactly what happened at this point. Paul Peach, Ilse's former husband, suggested that Varzi had been committed to a sanatorium in order to recover from his addiction, but there's no proof to either say that that's true or not. As Varzi's disappearance dragged on, war arrived in Europe. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, resulting in a declaration of war from Great Britain and France. Germany, which had been funneling money into its racing programs, redirected that money to the war effort. Automakers were forced to retool their workshops to produce things like armored vehicles or weapons. And because those were hubs of industry, they also became the target of bombing raids. After the 1940 running of the Targa Florio in Italy, racing largely ended in Europe. A handful of events continued on in the Americas until 1942, all with older cars and contested by local drivers. But in 1943, as the war dragged on and more of the world grew involved, racing dried up. Things were also allegedly difficult for Ilse Peach. It's said that the Italian government got personally involved in the Varzi Peach affair, going so far as to revoke her Italian residence permit for damaging one of Italy's greatest racing heroes. Hans Stuck, a former teammate of Varzi's, ran into Ilse in Munich in March of 1939. She recognized Stuck and approached him to beg for money, allegedly to acquire a forged passport that would allow her to travel to Italy. Stuck refused to give her money, but offered instead to pay for a hotel. That night, Ilse Peach attempted suicide in the street and was rushed to the hospital. She lived, then went on to marry a German opera singer during the war, seemingly having kicked her addiction. But where in the world was Achille Varzi? As with so much of Varzi's history, we know very little about what happened to him during the war. He married a woman named Norma Colombo, an old friend, in 1941, and it's believed he spent the war managing his family's textile business. At some point, he got clean. It's not clear when that happened or why, if morphine simply became impossible to come by as the war continued, or if he had determined his life needed to change well before any scarcity forced his hand. It's said that his new wife, Norma, was integral in coaching him back to health, but it's not clear if that happened before or after the marriage. Still, Varzi was back in fine form as the war ended. Though he was now 42 years old and had lost out on many of his prime competitive years due to addiction and war, he was ready to return to motorsport when racing revived in 1946. He returned to the Alfa Romeo team, taking victory at the 1946 Turin Grand Prix, the first race ever run under Formula One rules. That same year, he took a win at the Gran Premio del Valentino. The next year, growing ever more comfortable, he took 3 second-place finishes at 3 consecutive Grand Prix in Switzerland, Belgium, and Italy. It appeared as if the once great Italian racer had once again found the dazzling skill that first made him a star. But Varzi's stunning comeback was not destined to last for long. One of the first Grand Prix of the 1948 season was at Bremgarten, a track in Switzerland. An early July rain had wetted the racing surface, but Varzi was determined to get a few practice laps under his belt, perhaps to shake off the cobwebs of the off-season. Louis Chiron followed Varzi out onto the track, the Frenchman in a Talbot Lago, the Italian in his Alfa Romeo. Chiron had a clear view of Varzi slipping, perhaps on the damp track or perhaps on a patch of oil, through a fast S-bend. The Alfa Romeo clipped a wooden barrier, and the speed of the impact flipped the car. With nothing but a linen helmet to protect his head from colliding with the racing surface, Varzi was killed instantly. Just like that, his promising career and his life came to a sudden, tragic halt. Louis Chiron was the one to witness Achille Varzi's accident, which meant it was up to him to carry the news back to Norma Colombo, Varzi's wife of just a few years. No, she told Alfa Romeo, she did not wish for the team to withdraw out of mourning. She wanted them to go out and win the race on Sunday, something that Felice Trossi achieved for the grieving widow. Varzi's death at the 1948 Swiss Grand Prix wasn't the only tragedy at the circuit that weekend. 5 hours after Varzi's fatal crash, reigning 500cc European champion Omo Bonoteni died when his motorcycle struck a wooden pole during practice for the Grand Prix support race. In the Grand Prix itself, Swiss privateer Christian Kautz was killed in an accident at just 34 years old. Maurice Trintignant, too, was pronounced dead after being ejected from his car during a support race, but thankfully in that case, the doctors had spoken far too soon. Though Trintignant remained in a coma for a week, he returned to racing the following year. In the wake of Achille Varzi's accident, the FIA finally mandated crash helmets, which up until that point had been optional for drivers competing in Grand Prix. It's not particularly clear if a more robust helmet would have done anything to save Varzi's life, but at the very least, it was one of the initial moves toward creating a less dangerous racing environment for Grand Prix competitors. But Varzi's legacy, as you can imagine, is a complex one. His sudden death meant he never really had a chance to reflect on his morphine addiction, or to share how he found the courage and strength to get clean. Further, his isolation from the greater Italian social sphere means few people would comment accurately on Varzi after his death, to share the stories that would enable us to flesh out a deeply taciturn and private human being. We can, however, see his impact reflected in the drivers he inspired, particularly Juan Manuel Fangio. Varzi and Fangio met each other in the late 1940s when Varzi had returned to racing after the war, but just as Fangio was truly developing the skill that would make him a later world champion. After a 1948 race in Buenos Aires, where Fangio finished fourth, the second-placed Achille Varzi sought out the young Argentine racer after the event. See, he knew that Fangio was new to racing Grand Prix cars, and Varzi wanted to offer him some tips. Keep an eye on the instrument panel, make sure the rev counter never drops below 3,500 RPM, change gears regularly to maintain optimum revs. When Fangio first traveled to Europe for a race in San Remo, he was shocked to find Achille Varzi join him at his dinner table. There, the normally austere and often grim-faced Varzi struck up a comfortable kinship with a man 7 years his junior, confiding in Fangio that he was thinking of retiring soon, and perhaps of opening a driving school down in Argentina. He even went so far as to invite Fangio to visit him at his villa near Milan, but not long after that dinner, Varzi was killed. In 1949, the Automotive Club of Argentina helped pay for Fangio and a team of mechanics to head to Europe to truly start attempting to establish himself in the Grand Prix racing scene. Fangio, deeply touched by Achille Varzi's kindness during the brief period they knew each other, named his team Equipe Achille Varzi. He was able to work alongside Guido Bignami, Varzi's longtime mechanic. Varzi's father, Menotti, maintained the friendship with Fangio that his son had struck up. Menotti Varzi offered Fangio and the team use of his villa near Milan, where they could live and work on their cars. It was a home away from home. Fangio never forgot the impact Achille Varzi left on his life. When it came time for him to reflect on his inspirations and his mentors, Fangio said, "Varzi was to me a god. He is probably the driver I've most admired in my life, a man who cared only for his art." It is a warm and deeply fitting tribute to a racer who lost, then found, his calling in life. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. In the next one, we're going to talk about the groundbreaking innovations created by IndyCar's medical team and how Formula One refused to adopt them. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, make sure to check out the DPTJ Patreon. Subscribers get access to weekly blog posts where I delve into contemporary motorsport news or other random cultural things that relate to motorsport, as well as newsletters that round up the biggest events, past and present, that we should be paying attention to. Plus, if you want to send an email, I have an address for that, deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. Again, I want to extend a huge thank you to my two DPTJ World Champions, Ryan Lorman and Nicole Washington. These two icons are battling it out for world champion honors to see who can become the most iconic member of the DPTJ family. And I have to say, again, they're still neck and neck. To both Ryan and Nicole, thank you so much for your ongoing support. Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys could not exist without the support of people like you. I also want to read a great comment I received from Meredith, who wrote on the episode of Roberta Cowell, "This is an excellent discussion of Roberta Cowell's story. A genuinely inspiring trailblazer, but also someone who held some very uncomfortable views about fellow queer people. Difficult to strike the right balance in covering her story, but I think this podcast nails it." Thank you so much. Finally, don't forget to check out Home Field Apparel to stock up on some absolutely incredible motorsport merch. And don't forget to use code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each show. You can find the full list of sources in the episode description, and I'm probably going to have to send you down there right away because research for this episode was sporadic. As I mentioned earlier in the show, so much of the information I gleaned about Achille Varzi came from tons of different sources, primarily ones that compared him to Tazio Nuvolari. So, I referenced biographies on Enzo Ferrari, Tazio Nuvolari, and Juan Manuel Fangio, but I also dug into a ton of other websites and medical journals, trying to extract the details I needed. Those are all listed below, so if you're interested in more, head down there. Otherwise, I'd probably need another half hour just to read them all out to you. Thank you again for listening to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. I'll see you in the next episode.